Does God enjoy killing people? Is Jesus genocidal? I know it's a strange question. We're going to talk about it today. Pastor Dustin, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm feeling a little underdressed.
Yeah. Well, I had to be in the meeting, and
Look like you're ready to go to a fancy dinner or something.
Well, are you buying?
I thought you were going to take your wife. Don't take me.
Oh, okay. I got in trouble on that. I didn't see that one coming. Welcome to the Try Jesus Auburn podcast. I'm Pastor Crespo here with Dustin Hall. Pastor Hall, just really thankful. We're touching on a really interesting topic.
Yeah.
Now, before, as I said, this is going to be an interesting one. Does God enjoy killing people?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. You may be wondering, what? That's a crazy way to say it. So I was talking to Pastor Dustin. I told him, look, I was reading the Bible, and I came across a statement where David, the Bible says that David went and he did a census of the people. He numbered the army to try to get an idea of how many soldiers he had. So he did this census throughout the nation of Israel. As a result, he brought punishment upon the nation. 70,000 people died, Dustin. 70,000 Israelites died because of this one decision. And so I told my wife, I said, honey, what's the problem here? Why would this happen? A lot of people died, and it didn't seem like taking a census is such a big deal. And so we were throwing that around, and lo and behold, it ties directly in with the subject that you're going to be touching on today. So, the question of why is, no, this is going to come out wrong, but it seems like God sometimes is indifferent because of all these people that die when things happen. But is that true?
Indifferent, or even demands or commands that entire cities and peoples be destroyed. So, it's a tough question. It's one that people have wrestled with and struggled with, throughout the generations for a long time. And, one that gives us pause. It should give us pause.
Yeah.
And, probably each story is a little bit different in its reasoning and why God did what he did. And I think in that case, there's a lot of details we don't know.
Yeah.
But I think there's a couple general principles that we can use to help us understand why that may have taken place. Those things may have taken place.
Right.
I think the first thing that we need to do is recognize, number one, that we often will try to judge ancient practices and customs with modern day ethics and morals. So in other words, we're expecting people back then to behave the way that we behave now, or the things that we believe is equal and fair and good now.
Right.
So the definition of what is right and wrong, obviously there is absolute truth throughout all the generations. God is truth, but judging ancient customs and practices and why God did certain things at certain times by modern day standards can be very confusing and even wrong sometimes to do it that way, to think of it that way.
Yeah, I think of God never approved of slavery, but there were slaves kept in the days of the Bible, and he even gave them rules on how to treat them better.
Yeah.
It can get very deep.
Yeah.
But here we have the temptation to have to just have a totally wrong picture of God, right? So what's the deal? What happens when these things? How does someone process when they hear stories of all these people dying, or God took an action and people lost their lives?
So when we think of the ultimate judgment at the end of time, and we think of different Bible stories, there usually is a common thread, and that common thread is there comes a time where societies and people, and even ultimately life here on planet Earth, humanity reaches a point of no return. And once we get to that point of no return, there's no coming back from it. And of course, we believe in victory and second chances and Jesus forgiving us. And I believe in all those things. And I believe that grace and mercy is available to all people right here and right now. But if you look at the way our world is going, it seems like it's getting to a point where we're going to hit a point of no return, where evil is just so evil, and we're not going to recover. We can't come back.
So you're saying at the same time that two things are true, that God's unending mercy, his unfathomable grace, the forgiveness of people's sins, it's all there, but you can get to a point of no return.
Yeah.
But you're talking about as a group, as a world, or as a nation or something.
And actually, in our next episode, I'm going to talk about how we as people that want to be delivered from a world that seems to be driving straight into a tree, into destruction, whatever, off the bridge,
Yeah.
how we can get out of that.
Yeah,
That's the next episode. But I want to focus a little bit
So
more
this
on
is the two-part. This
Yes.
is a two-part podcast. So just
a little bit more on this issue of what does it look like when humanity's getting to the point of no return,
Yeah.
and when God brought those judgments. And I think we can understand the genocidal Jesus
Mhm.
in a little bit different way when we look at those things. So the first one I want to look at is Sodom. It's that famous story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 13 describes this interaction between Abraham and Lot. Abraham, his name at the time was Abram, but we'll call him Abraham. It's because what everybody knows him by. But Abraham and Lot, they were together. They were both very wealthy. They had a lot of animals and grazing animals, so much so that they all couldn't stay in the same place because there wasn't enough grazing land. And so they needed to split up. And Lot looked around, and Abraham gave him his choice of where he wanted to move. And Lot chose what eventually became known as Sodom, or the area around Sodom, I should say.
He pitched his tent towards Sodom.
Yeah. And Sodom is described in the Bible, and Lot uses the words like the garden of God, like the garden of God, like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And as you look into it, the biblical description, it was lush, it was beautiful, things grew easily there. It was a place of ease and wealth and riches, and people got lazy. And that laziness plays into what we're going to talk about here in just a minute. But everything was readily available. And the Bible describes Sodom a little bit later, a few chapters later, after this interaction between Abraham and Lot, describes it in a certain way. And I think we have that verse. It's Genesis 18, I believe. Genesis 18:20. It says this: "Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." Now, a lot of times people look at that and go, oh, they think of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Oh, God's awful. He killed all these people. But they miss that part. Sodom and Gomorrah was doing something that was causing great suffering. So in other words, you get this idea that prayers are going up to God about the pain and suffering that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah are causing. And God says it's great, so much so that he comes down out of heaven to investigate this. So it's a really significant amount of suffering that these places are causing humans. Humanity.
I just as I was listening to you explain it, I really have not heard this Garden of Eden term. I just never know. I guess I never noticed it. That Sodom was beautiful, and so it was easier. People were wealthy, and I think you cannot escape wealth, ease, with eventually, if you have nothing to do, idle hands are what?
Devil's playground.
Then so wickedness, wealth, ease, beautiful climate,
self-indulgence.
I wonder if there are places like that today. we're not going to mention them, but
it's a perfect, I think, illustration of what happens in human life and even the course of human history. It starts off in the Garden of God, and then sin continues to perpetuate, and you get to the point where you're causing great suffering, where people are crying out to heaven to be delivered from whatever pain you're causing. Right. And that's where you get to the point of no return. And we actually get a little more detail even into Sodom as the story goes on. So what happens a little bit later is that God comes down, and he first stops at Abraham's tent and talks to Abraham, where Abraham's living. And he tells Abraham, hey, look, I've got to go to Sodom and check this out. And, I think I'm going to find a lot of wickedness and suffering, and we're going to have to put an end to this place. And so Abraham starts pleading the case for the city. And he says, oh, Lord, if you find 50 righteous people there, will you destroy the city? And God says, no, for 50, I won't. And he goes 40, 30, 20, even down to 10. So God, willing to extend mercy, willing to extend grace here, even for 10 people. He says, for 10 people, I won't destroy it. Well, then we
The city didn't even have that.
Yeah, this agreement takes place.
Wow.
And then God and angels go to Sodom, and something really significant happens. And that's Genesis 19 and verse 5. So they get there, they meet up with Lot. And Lot's living in Sodom now, not just around Sodom. But listen to what it says. It says, but before they lay down, this is at night, Lot invited these angels and maybe God himself into his home. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, children all the way through adults here, all the people to the last man or the last person. So this is the entire city.
Yeah.
Surround the house. And they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after them, and said to them, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Okay, so it's subtle there, but it's clear what the people of the city want to do to these strangers. They want to capture them, hold them hostage, and rape them. And the reason why this is such a telling story, not just because of what we just said, but because it's such a stark contrast. You notice what Lot does to the strangers. Lot invites them in. He makes them comfortable. He protects them and takes care of them.
Right.
This was a major part of society, especially Abraham and God's people at the time. They were to care for the stranger, care for the sojourner, protect them, make sure they're loved and nurtured while they're there. And you contrast that with the way the people of Sodom want to treat those strangers.
Yeah.
So one goes from taking care of them, even to the degree where Lot is willing to give up his own children to the mob rather than the strangers.
Right.
Protect them as his own, versus people that want to hold strangers hostage and rape them. That is a perfect example of
going too far,
getting to the point of no return.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so something can happen in us as humans where sin multiplies, it grows, darkness grows, and as an entire society, we can get to the point of no return. And Sodom got to that point of no return. Now, Lot and his family, with the exception of his wife, were the kind of people that wanted to get out and escape where the city was headed.
Right.
And again, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But the point is, Sodom got to the point of no return, And that's when God destroys the entire city, young and old.
I think for a moment, imagine being someone who is an inhabitant of a city next to the cities of the plain. They weren't destroyed. They just saw that the cities were destroyed. They would tend to have a picture of God as being genocidal or psychopath or just hateful.
Unless they were the target of some of the wickedness and suffering they were causing.
Right, but sometimes we don't put two and two together because we don't see the full picture, but then we still want to make conclusions.
Yeah.
So
that is a major explanation. We're going to see a little more here in a second. The other part is that people struggle with is, what about the children? What about kids in these situations?
That's a tough one.
And it is a tough one, but I want to propose a possible explanation for children in the context of genocide that God sanctions or causes. Well, I believe at some point, I don't know what that age is, but there's an age of innocence, right? So an age where kids don't know any better and they can't be held really responsible for their actions and their decisions because they're kids. They're little, they're innocent, they don't know. And I think in some of these cases where the society had gotten so far away from being the humans that God created us, past that point of no return, that God allows some of those innocents to be destroyed, along with the adults, not to condemn them, but to save them.
Yeah.
So he takes their life in their age of innocence to make sure that, one, their DNA that they inherited from their parents doesn't take over and make them the way their parents were. And also so that their culture and their society don't overtake them so that they'll be lost. So I think it's very plausible to say some of these kids are saved because God saved them in their innocence in these horrible, horrible
Yeah.
situations.
Those are those hard things. If you don't have a relationship with God, if you have nothing upon which to base it on, those are tough pills to swallow.
Mm-hmm.
They're very
Yeah.
difficult.
They are. So we go a little later in the story of Abraham, and God eventually gets around to telling Abraham the future and what's going to happen to Abraham's descendants. And he says, okay, Lot went that way, but Abraham, I want you to look around. Everything you see is going to be the promised land, and your descendants are going to live here throughout the generations. He's talking about, Israel, Canaan.
Yeah, right.
And he says, but it's not going to last for you very long. So him and his immediate descendants, yes, but then there's going to be a period where your people are lost. And so let's pick that up. It's in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. So God's actually going to describe the exile to Egypt. And there's an interesting phrase in here. So let's read this. Genesis 15:13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there. He's talking about Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And they will be afflicted for 400 years. And that's how long the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they, so his descendants, will come back here in the fourth generation. The fourth generation. Now listen to this. This is the important part. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. That's the important part. The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So again, we're talking about societies and people in our world. As humans, we can get to the point of no return. And that's what that was just describing. The Amorites. Okay, so who are the Amorites? The Amorites were related to the Canaanites, the Jebusites. They were all, yeah, pretty much. And they were the ones that would inhabit the promised land while Abraham's descendants are in
slavery.
Egypt.
Okay.
Yep. And after God's people are led out of Egypt, going back to the promised land, God said to them, you need to wipe these people out. So again, genocidal stories, God sanctioned genocide, right?
Yeah.
Why? It goes back to what we just read. God's saying your people can't come and conquer them until their sins are complete. In other words, sin is going to run its course. Yeah. They're going to get to a point of no return. And at that time is when judgment will come and you can destroy them. So God is actually being merciful here.
That is probably the one thing that I think people have difficulty understanding, that God is being merciful when he takes or allows an action that brings about this type of tragedy.
Yeah. Think about that. He's saying, I'm going to give them every opportunity. Another example of this is Jonah. God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh and proclaim judgment. Nineveh was going to be destroyed. But what happened? They heard that message and they repented.
Right.
They turned away from it and their city was saved. So what God is saying to Abraham here is, I'm going to give the Amorites every possible chance, all the way to the fourth generation living here, to turn away from their wicked ways. So
you're in the response to the question of, is God genocidal? He's not genocidal. You're saying his actions are actually merciful if you look at it properly.
Yes, because if you know more about what we saw it in Sodom, but let's look at it in this case. So one of the cities that God told the children of Israel to conquer under Joshua when they went back to the promised land was Jericho. The Amorites were inhabiting Jericho. What were the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Amorites doing? They were sacrificing children to idols, babies. They were sacrificing to idols. Prostitution and human trafficking was a major issue. Murder and violence. They were an incredibly violent, sexually perverse, just evil society. These people were evil societies. They had gotten to the point of no return. And so if you think about this, if God just continues to let societies go like that, our world go on forever and never put an end to it,
Yeah.
the suffering compounds, the darkness compounds. How long can God allow these kinds of things to go on without intervening?
God can't win, right? Because if he doesn't take action and they're suffering, he gets blamed for the suffering.
Right.
But if he does take action for the suffering, then he gets blamed for being genocidal, killing whole nations of people.
And God just said to Abram, I'm going to give them every opportunity. I'm going to wait to the fourth generation for them to turn away. But he knows in his mind they're not going to. So he says to Abraham, we're going to come in. And that's when God takes the people to the edge of Jericho.
Right.
The Amorites are there, and the city is destroyed, as well as other parts of the promised land.
So let me ask you a question. This idea, this notion of getting to a point of no return, they're typically, you look at certain things where you say, okay, this is it. So one, just our world is kind of crazy. There's a lot of things happening. Do you see us getting to that point of no return right now? One, two, what might be, because you don't know, but what might be some signs that you say, okay, this is beyond the line?
Well, I think maybe we need to have people stay around for the next episode to answer that question.
Okay, good.
But I want to point out 1 John 2:15 because it speaks right to this. And we've referred to this passage before on the podcast, but it's really powerful. And so 1 John 2:15, it says, do not love the world or the things in the world. Now, that's not talking about trees and dogs and, your friend. It's talking about the way the world works. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life, other Bible versions say the lust of the flesh. So this is sinful stuff. Is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world, and here's the word, is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. So again, there's that word, passing away. It's dying. And there comes a point where in the death process where doctors can't save you anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, they've done all they could.
They've done all they can. And I think if we pay attention in that verse, the lust of the flesh, the desires of our bodies, our addictions, our frail, our sinfulness, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, things we covet, things we want. As we begin to see those lusts completely taking over, and people having no regard for wanting anything different, I think we really need to pay attention because it's all signs that the world is on hospice. Human life is in its final days.
It's like we're not talking about it right now, but this whole notion of the unforgivable sin, the point at which beyond you can't turn back.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that too. Some people might be watching this and going, am I there? Have I reached that? And I would say, if you're worried about it, no, you haven't gotten to that point. If you're concerned with, am I too far away from God? Have I reached the point of no return? That's a sign that no, you haven't. God is still working on you. But when we get to the point where we no longer hear God's voice, when we no longer feel him pulling on our heartstrings, when we are doing things that are violent and hateful and hurtful, and we don't care, and it becomes the norm, that's when we need to really pay attention. And the question we have to ask ourselves as people who are worried whether we have reached that personally, look around the world. Because as you see that more prominently in the world, we can recognize the world's time is short.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's interesting. I think, as I was saying, what I was reading just caused me to think about how easy it is to think of God as a horrible God. Think of God. He enjoyed this, but there's more there. And when I was talking with my wife about this, it's just funny that we're talking about this. When this came up, I said, if I didn't have the experiences that I've had in my life with God, I would read something like this and have a very negative view of who God is. So you've got to have that experience. You got to have that relationship with God where you can read it and know what is the character of God like. Well, that doesn't line up with the character. I'm missing something.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't judge. I don't have enough information. And maybe that's the best thing to get out of the podcast. If you have a bad picture of God because you've seen something like this, or maybe you have a bad picture of God because you see current suffering.
Yeah, that's the thing too. Is we want God to be love, but there can be no love without justice. Because to allow the people of Sodom to cause great suffering that's crying up to heaven, crying out to heaven, and God saying, yeah, I'm loving, I'm just going to let them go.
Yeah. See, God can't win.
Right.
God cannot win. If he takes action, he's horrible. If he doesn't take action, well, no, you're in charge. Why did you let this happen?
Right. And the key to all this too is we have to decide. We have to choose.
Yeah.
Do you want to allow sin and darkness and wickedness to continue to multiply in your life?
Yeah.
So that, you become dark and based and like these societies did? Right. Or, are you going to turn things around? And I think there's one verse that we didn't cover, and I think we probably should. It's in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4.
This one here?
Yeah, it says, this is in the Ten Commandments. It says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, what is in the earth beneath. But there's this passage a little bit later, this sentence a little bit later. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, am your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. There it is again, the third and fourth generation. Yeah. It's really interesting. This is a reference to the fact that sin and darkness is generational. Yeah. So the sins of fathers get passed down from generation to generation to generation.
That's right.
And they don't tend, and many times, if we choose not to turn around and turn away from them, they tend to get worse. And that's what was happening in Sodom. That's what was happening in Jericho with the Amorites and in the Promised Land, and many of these societies that God asked the children of Israel to wipe out, or he wiped out himself. Yeah. It had escalated with each passing generation. Now, the question for us is, what about me? And we think of our own lives. My father was an alcoholic. Somebody else's parents were abusive. Somebody, we need to ask ourselves the question, am I doomed to fall to the same sins that my fathers did before me? Right. Well, God, we are not cursed. And that's where free will comes in. Right. God allows us to choose. And because Jesus died for the whole world, everyone has the ability to be delivered from generational sin. Yeah. And so we are not doomed or trapped within the sins of our ancestors. I think our descent. Yeah, our ancestors.
I think if someone's listening, it's almost like there are several different things that on the face of it seem to butt up against each other. The idea that God is merciful, God's loving, God's forgiving, but there's a line beyond which a person or a country or whatever can go beyond. Then you talk about these other things about, God taking an action against someone. Well, he's supposed to be love, and he is love, but love without justice is not love. Justice without love is not justice. It's all confusing, folks. but I think it makes it, the idea is what you're saying is that there are reasons why God does what he does. And I'll tell you my take from what you're sharing here is it's like there are things that God does that I don't understand, but I've learned enough about the character of God that I'm not going to be willing to ascribe bad things to God's character, because if he loves me, if he loves me, then he's amazing, because I'm not the easiest person to love. So
for God so loved the world. It doesn't say for God so loved the Israelites and hated the Canaanites. Right. For God so loved the world. God loved the Canaanites too. And the linchpin is, what are you going to choose? What are you going to decide? Are you going to decide to just fall prey to the generational sin and let it continue and compound in your life?
Yeah.
Or do you want to make the decision today, right now, to be delivered from the trends of our society,
Right.
the way our world is headed, the way your family that came before you, the sins that they made?
Yeah.
Jesus died for everyone, every single person.
Yeah.
And we can be delivered from those sins and not ever reach the point of no return.
Right.
But mercy has to have its limits.
Right.
It has to. Otherwise, there can be no justice.
Right.
God can't just allow violence and murder of babies and rape and incest and all these things that these people groups were doing,
Yeah.
and causing all of this pain, and be a loving God.
Yeah.
That mercy has to have its limits. But the good news is, for anyone, even people that had been engaged in that behavior, had they ever said, Lord, deliver me from this,
Yeah.
he would come through and deliver
Amen.
them, which is the story in our next episode.
Well, I think that's probably how we'll end this episode. If you have a negative picture of God, there's a lot of things that you can take away from this episode. You know, judging without all the information, judging, making statements without knowing what the times were like back then, or you know, if God puts up with you, then that should tell you how amazing he is. Should I say that to the listener?
Yeah,
Sorry. If God puts up with me, then God must be pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Now, we'll end the podcast, but we can't go without giving the website. Right? TryJesusAuburn.com. If you want to here we communicate with you. The website is where you can communicate with us. TryJesusAuburn.com. There's actually some really cool things that were happening. Do you want to talk about the live thing?
So make sure you subscribe to YouTube or follow us on Facebook, or both. Both would be best, because on Friday nights at 7:30, I'm going to start doing live sessions where people can write in questions. I want to pray for you live on the air. I want to talk about some of these things, maybe flesh out a little bit more some of the podcast episodes and questions that people have had. So we're going to do live sessions where I can interact with you live. And so you'll want to make sure that whenever we go live, you get that alert, and subscribing will help you get that alert.
That's right. And there's something we're not ready to tell everyone just yet, but we want to tell you that, well, let me put it a different way. Thank you. Thank you for the response that you've given to this podcast. You know, liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, signing up for our newsletter. This has been just a tremendous journey. We haven't even completed a full year yet.
No.
We're going to have to do something special, I think, for that. But because of the things that are happening, the podcast is growing. And so very shortly, we'll be announcing something here. But we're going to keep that under wraps for now. Stay tuned. Until then, we'll be looking forward to the live on Facebook and YouTube. But this is really exciting stuff. All right. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.